it remained for the Greeks to really take medicine and make a science out of it in the West. Their civilization, they valued learning, and they created a professional caste of physicians. And of course, the most famous of them is Hippocrates, who probably many of you have heard of because you hear about the Hippocratic Oath that doctors used to take and things like that. So Hippocrates is, even by the medical establishment, he is regarded as the father of modern medicine. And he was a very astute observer of human nature and of the nature in general. And from these observations, he was able to do a tremendous amount of good. He really revolutionized medicine, took it away from superstition, and brought it in the realms of science. And he's the one who coined the term that we're going to look at in a few minutes called vitalist. Because that's what I am. I'm a vitalist. And I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. He also came up with a primary dictum of healing. Above all, do no harm. That was the primary, rule. If you see the Hippocratic Oath, that's the number one rule in the Hippocratic Oath. Interestingly enough, now this is why they don't take the Hippocratic Oath anymore in medical school. It's also, there's a line in there about, I will give my patient no poisonous substances. And another one is I will not give any woman a substance to cause her to have an abortion. So obviously, the medical profession has gotten way off from where Hippocrates was. Now, at the same time, there was another philosopher named Democritus, and he coined the term atomist. He said that basically Hippocrates was wrong. Hippocrates was too superstitious. So the vitalists believe the body has an inner life force or soul, and that God gave it the intelligence to heal itself if it's treated right and nourished properly. And that makes a lot of sense because, for example, out in the wild, you don't see a lot of sick animals. I mean, you don't see a moose out there with a walker, because he's got arthritis. Or you don't see animals in the wild getting heart disease or cancer. And that's because they're eating what God intended them to eat. Now, you do see those things with our pets, with dogs and cats, but that's because most of those animals eat what we eat. We feed them, they sit there at the table, like that, and we feed them table scraps and so on. So, this is the idea. The word vitalist comes from the Latin word vita, which means life, and it basically means that there is a power within the body to heal itself that God gave us, and if we just get out of its way and let it do it, it will. Now, on the other hand, these atomists, the followers of Democritus, deny this. They were sort of the Sadducees of medicine. As some of you may know, the Sadducees in the Bible denied the spiritual world. They denied the resurrection. And they believe that the body can be reduced to ever tinier and tinier parts, which can be replaced or else, somehow plunged out, like we're plumbing, basically. And that's like what an angioplasty is. That's what cardiac surgery is. Okay. Now, the key word for atomists is control. They believe that nature is not good, that nature is out of control, and that we need to force it to be in control. And so, as I said, the body is like a plumbing system where the parts can be unclogged or replaced. And they will often use drastic measures like drugs or surgery to force the body to do what is wanted. Okay, now let's say you're an atomist. What would you do with a patient who had a fever? Well, you assume the body is stupid, that it's malfunctioning in some way. And so what you would do is you would give the body something like aspirin to take down the fever. Now, what about if you were a vitalist? If you were a vitalist, you would assume that if the body has a fever, it's because the body knows what it's doing. You would assume that, and as we now know today, that there is no virus, no bacteria that can live in temperatures higher than 105 degrees. And so when the body is fighting off, that when the immune system kicks into high gear because there's a virus or a bacteria, you get a fever. And if you let that fever run its course, and in fact even enhance the fever by putting the person in a tub of very hot water and giving them hot yarrow tea to drink, which is a sudorific, which means it makes you sweat, you'll basically sweat the toxins out and you'll be fine in just a couple of hours. But You know, if the atomist is allowed to do things, he will take the fever away, so then the body can't get rid of the virus and the person gets sicker, and then he says, oh, well, we'll give you antibiotics to get rid of the bacteria. Of course, the trouble is the antibiotics cause even more problems, and so then the person is even sicker. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Now, on the other hand, back to the atomists. They are not oriented much toward preventative medicine. It's really only been in the last 20 years or so that atomistic type doctors have looked at prevention. They used to just think of the symptoms. Okay, you come in, you've got a headache. They would not think, okay, why is there a headache? Or let's say you have a pain in your toe. They just give you something to take away the pain. They wouldn't worry about why it was there. And so you take away the symptoms, you've taken away the problem. And I tell people this would be a little like if you're driving a car and let's say the red lights come on your dashboard. So what you do is you reach under and you snip the wires that make the lights go on. And you keep on driving. Everything's fine, right? No more symptoms. Until all of a sudden, because you have no oil left, your engine seizes up. Not a good deal. Now, these groups the atomists tend to be invasive. They like to poke things into you. They like to stick you with needles. They like to cut you up. You know, a good example would be you got swollen tonsils, tonsillitis. So naturally, what do? They cut them out. Now, here's the thing. Let's say, for example, I hit my thumb with a hammer. It's swollen and it hurts. Let's cut it off, right? You don't need this thumb. That's what they do, you know. Or let's say, for example, you're thinking, in fact, I got to tell you this, my wife, because we were in the generation, let's see, what am I, 53, where they were cutting out everybody's tonsils. And my wife even her parents got a benefit of a twofer sale. Her brother had to have his tonsils out because they were inflamed, and so they said, well, bring your other daughter in and she can have them out for free. Even though she wasn't sick, they took out her tonsils. Now we know that tonsils are an important part of the immune system. But the doctors at least didn't know that then. And so Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, who wrote a really great book, it's called How to Raise a Healthy Child in Spite of Your Pediatrician. And he said the only mistake God ever made was putting the tonsils too close to the surgeon's knife. Because you could just reach down there, down the throat, you know, anesthetize the person and snip. You know, $5,000, just like that. And the funny thing is that they took my wife's tonsils out because they said, well, they might get swollen someday. And that's like saying, well, I'm going to cut off my thumb because someday I might hit it with a hammer. I'll never hit that thumb with a hammer if I take it off, right? So, you know, and of course they do things like they give you aspirin if you have headache pain, and then they do various forms of cardiac surgery, right up including the rather drastic thing of taking your heart out and putting some other poor sucker's heart in. I always thought that was kind of unfair because it costs like $50,000. They get the heart for free. You know, you're a heart donor. You know, like your family doesn't get 20 grand because you give them a heart. That would be unethical. You know, and so they take the heart and put it into you, and then they charge 50 grand or something. So anyhow, now there is a good, and I don't want to sound like like Stan said, I love doctors. I think doctors are some of the most wonderful people because they've gone to a great deal of expense and effort to learn their craft. It's not their fault that the people that are teaching them aren't telling them the whole story. They're trying to heal people, and they're getting very frustrated. But there is a place where atomism works real well, and that's in the emergency room. Like if you break a leg, you don't want to just, you know, take some white willow bark to take away the pain when, you know, you got this hunk of bone sticking out of your leg and you're walking around like this. No, you want to have someone go in and set the bone. Or if you're in a car accident or some other thing where you're really banged up bad and you're in massive pain, you know, hey, give me some morphine, you know, especially since the FDA says we can't have an herbal extract from the opium poppy, which is a natural herbal pain reliever, which is what they make morphine out of. So, you know, I say there is a very good place, and these people are, I mean, if you watch an emergency room team work, they're awesome, and I highly respect them. But the funny thing is that's about the only place where this stuff is good. Now, how about vitalism? Well, here the key word is helper or teacher. God is viewed as the healer. Hippocrates said that. He says, I have never healed a single patient. God is the healer. And, he was a pagan, for heaven's sakes. I mean, he was a Greek. He lived 400 years before Jesus. And, yet he understood that. He was just there to facilitate the process of healing. Vitalists believe in allowing the body to do what it's supposed to do. They're less symptom-oriented. They're more prevention-oriented. In other words, they believe in teaching someone, note the teacher thing, in how to live a healthy life, to do away with not only the symptoms, but the cause. Okay. The main purpose of vitalism, as I said before with Hippocrates, above all, do no harm. Don't hurt the patient. Observe and listen to the body. Assume the body has a wisdom all its own. Teach the patient to heal him or herself. Use of nutrition and other non-invasive procedures to facilitate healing. We don't believe in puncturing the skin. See, the skin is a marvelous line of defense. God gave this skin to us, and how many of you realize that even your sweat, which we assiduously rub off and put anti-deodorants and antiperspirants on, the sweat on our bodies is antibacterial. Did you know that? And the skin is marvelously made to keep out disease. So what do the atomists do? They say, oh, it's time for your flu shot. Right through the skin. They take a live virus and put it right in the skin. We don't believe in that. And in fact, if you hear an herbalist talking about injections, I hate to tell you, but what they're talking about is an enema, which means you take some herbal tinctures and inject it up the rectum. And you don't, and understand, that's not penetrating the skin. Because, see, there's a solid tube from the mouth all the way down to the anus. And that's all your skin. The body is basically a big tube with arms and legs attached. So we can go to McDonald's and get a Happy Meal, right? Anyway, so we treat with herbs, with massage, with hydrotherapy, aromatherapy, and nutritional consultation. Because most people have some dietary issues that they need help with. The proper place of vitalism is everywhere else except the ER. In fact, it's funny, Dr. Andrew Weil, I don't know if you've heard of him or not, he's an MD, but he's into this complementary medicine, which means he combines herbal and vitamins with regular medicine. And he says, actually, what we call MD or chemical medicine should be the alternative. And it should be the last resort. And that 95% of what most people suffer from could be dealt with by herbs or therapy or acupressure or something like that. Okay, atomist approach, as I said, is great for car accidents, head trauma, etc. Now, let's move on in history. From the time of Hippocrates on, essentially medical history is a philosophical battle between the vitalists and the atomists. It's a conflict between man wanting to control and being willing to submit to God's wisdom, between man wanting to control versus wanting to be willing to admit to God's wisdom. And this struggle is still going on today. Now, during the intertestamental period, in the time of Jesus and the apostles, it's important to realize that basically vitalism was what was practiced. And the Greek medicine, you see, was outstanding, as I had mentioned, and it was kind of captured by the Roman Empire. See, Rome, when they took over Greece, they realized Greece had an incredible culture. They even stole all their gods. How many of you know they took Zeus and made him into Jupiter. They took Hermes and made him into Mercury, and so on. So they also captured Greek medicine and the Greek doctors. And that's part of the reason the Roman legions were so powerful and so unstoppable, is they took their Greek doctors and their herbs with them, and then what was neat is they planted herbs everywhere, kind of like Johnny Appleseed. And so they spread all these wonderful medicinal herbs all over Europe, wherever they went to conquer. Now, the next big thing that happened was Galen. Now, Galen was a doctor in the city of Pergamos. How many of you know what the city of Pergamos is called in Revelation? It's where Satan's seat is. That's Revelation chapter 2, verse 13. And basically, Galen tried to pretend that he was a follower of Hippocrates, but he really was not. In fact, this is the guy, this fellow, just for your information. You all know this four temperament thing that's been going around the church for about 10 or 15 years now. That I think Tim LaHaye started it. That you're sanguine and choleric and melancholic and I forget what the last one is. But anyway, that's from Galen. He got that from a pagan philosopher and medical doctor from nearly 2,000 years ago. Galen lived 130 to 200. And many of his methods were very dogmatic rather than scientifically, but he was an enormous influence. He basically, because the church glommed onto him, the Christian church and later on the Catholic Church really endorsed him, he became sort of the rule for almost 1,400 years. And that was the Dark Ages, the collapse of the Roman Empire. And what happened is in about the 2nd, 3rd century, there started to come around these monks. Because what had happened was the church had begun to get very worldly once it kind of married itself to Constantine and the Roman Empire. And so to keep themselves holy from all of this debauchery, some of these monks went off by themselves to just pray. And Benedict was one of the great founders of the monastic systems, the Benedictine order, and he encouraged monastic medicine, and they were the custodians of herbal lore. And he started the first hospice, and a few centuries later, these same monks started the first hospital. So notice, people who were followers of Jesus, or at least trying to be, were the people that started hospitals. In 805, medicine, and then it was called physics. So you were a doctor of physic or a physician. That's where our term today, physician, comes from, began to be taught in a university. And the famous monastery of St. Gall's had an herb garden and a hospital attached. And this became very common. William of Salicito in 1210 to 1280 set up the first school of surgery. Now, at 1347, we have the end of the world. That's what it was called. The plague showed up. What we call today bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis. And this was a very, very horrible disease which wiped out almost a third of Europe. And the herbalists didn't know what to do because it was so new and it was a different kind of disease, and it also spread so fast because of superstitious hygiene practices. What do I mean by that? Well, see, the pagan Romans were really into bathing. They had public baths, and you may have seen pictures or maybe been over to like Italy or Europe, and they had these huge viaducts, these aqueducts they were called, marvelously engineered so they could bring in water. No matter where you were, you'd have fresh running water. Great engineering. And so they would have all these baths where they would bathe, and it was like a social thing because they'd bathe in the nude with both sexes, and so it was, and when the Christians saw this, they thought this was a little bizarre, and so they backed away from that, and they got the idea, somebody, I think it was Augustine, who was an early, Catholic writer, got the idea that it was evil to bathe. You didn't want to bathe any more than you absolutely had to. And so, the more holy you were, the less you bathed. And in fact, the famous saint, Thomas of Canterbury, when he was killed in the cathedral that is now Canterbury Cathedral, and they took his body to prepare it for burial. They had to chip his clothes off with a mallet and chisel because he had not bathed in like 20 years. Now imagine what these people smelled like. And, and of course the other thing is the garbage was just chucked out the window. If you had a chamber pot, as they were euphemistically called, you just throw it out the window. And if somebody was walking down there, too bad, There was no sewer systems. There was no way to get rid of garbage, food garbage or human waste or animal waste. The streets were full of manure. You'd walk like ankle deep in manure everywhere you went, both human and horse. And in this kind of a thing, this really spread. The plague really spread. Now, along came a gentleman who did much good but also much damage. This is the founder of modern medicine. His name is Paracelsus. His real name, you ready for this, is Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. For reasons that are obvious, he changed his name to Paracelsus. And he was an occultist. He was an alchemist. He was brilliant. He was a genius. But he's the guy who popularized the idea of using poison to treat medicine, to treat diseases. And that was the beginning of modern pharmaceuticals. He used a lot of mercury. In fact, the story is told, in fact, Stan was asking me about this today in interviews. How did this kind of new medicine with mercury get so popular? Well, what happened is the Pope, I need to back up a step. A new disease, again, came over from the New World that no one had ever seen before. We today call it syphilis. And it was ravaging Europe because, again, bad sanitation, they had no idea what was going on. The Pope got syphilis. Gee, I wonder how that happened. You know, he probably got it from toilet seat. But anyway, so he called in his herbal healers. They couldn't deal with it because it was new. They had to go back and kind of rethink things. So what happened? He heard about Paracelsus, as this guy was famous. He came in on his mercury, gave the Pope mercury, and the idea is you give something to a patient, and if it doesn't kill the patient before it kills the disease, you're a success. That's how it works. And that's how chemotherapy works. Today, it's the same idea. You basically put mustard gas, because that's what chemotherapy is, it's mustard gas, into a person, and their hair falls out and they feel horrible, and you just hope they kill the cancer before they kill the patient. So, you know, he used quicksilver and healed the Pope. Quicksilver being the old-fashioned name for mercury. And so the Pope said, okay, Daba Daba Daba, I bless you, and you are good, and these evil herb people that tried to kill me, they're bad. And so he declared that all herbalists should be burned at the stake as witches. And he endorsed the people that use mercury. Now, it's interesting, because following Paracelsus, there was an extensive use of mercury and other disgusting things. They'd use insect parts and bug parts, and they'd also use leeches to drain people. A lot of you probably heard of this, you know, because this was going on right up until the end of the 19th century. They would put leeches on you, or they would cut you and let the blood come out, and this was a way they would heal people. And sometimes it worked. A lot of times it didn't. But the funny thing is that the herbal doctors called these other medical people quicks or quacks, and that's where the term came from. But now the medical establishments have flipped that around, and now we're the quacks, even though they're the ones that are using toxic medicine. Now, how many of you realize that George Washington, the father of our country, is the most famous casualty of allopathic medicine, of this chemical medicine? He caught a cold or flu while riding out in the rain, and the doctors came, and first of all, they bled him, put leeches on him. That didn't help. He felt worse. So then they bled him without the leeches. They just cut him and let him bleed into a bucket. And then that didn't work, so he was given mercury plasters. And he felt even worse, and so finally they gave him mercury in internal doses. Of course, I hope all of you know mercury is poisonous. And it killed him. You know, he was basically doctored to death. And he wasn't the last. Now, I've used the word allopathy, and I deliberately didn't really define it because it doesn't make sense to define it until there's an opposite to define it with. There was another form of healing that came along around the beginning of the 19th century called homeopathy. Now, homo is like a word that means like. For example, homosexuals are attracted to the same sex. And homogenized milk is all whipped up, so it's all the same. Well, homeopathy is the idea of like cures like. So, for example, if you have a fever, you would be given a tincture that contained a eeny-weeny minute part of an herb that causes fever. Now, isn't that interesting? Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but there are many, many thousands of homeopaths today. In fact, it's the dominant form of medicine in England. Additionally, there is one homeopathic remedy that's still part of modern medical practice, even with the AMA. It's nitroglycerin. You know, those of you, if any of you know someone who has a heart condition, angina, or chronic heart failure, they're often given these little tiny white pills that are made out of nitroglycerin. Now you think nitroglycerin, doesn't it blow up, you know? And what they're told is if you get angina, if you get chest pain, put 1 or 2 of these little pills under your tongue. And that's exactly how homeopathic remedies are taken. There's minute amounts of nitro in those pills, and it does work. Interesting. I'm personally not a homeopath. I know how it works, but I don't really get into it that much. And Hahnemann is the guy who started calling these other doctors allopaths, because allo means different. So they do the opposite thing. If you have a fever, as I've said before, they give you something to take down the fever. Now, by 1825 in this country, allopaths, in other words, the chemical medical type doctors, were the dominant form of doctors. But the homeopaths and the herbalists were gaining fast. This is because their treatments were not expensive, nor were they so repugnant. I mean, would you want leeches put on your body? You know, would you want mercury plasters put on your head? No, no. They also worked. Golly gee willikers. Even the press was opposed to these MDs. This is what some of the newspapers said about this controversy. Quote, to many people, the interests of the medical profession as a whole were opposed to the best interests of society. Another article condemned the, quote, rigidly anti-innovative attitude which the old school doctors have so consistently maintained for centuries. Now, in the middle of this, along came a fellow named Samuel Thompson. And he's a very famous and very popular, very iconoclastic individual who was a herbal healer. And he basically, his philosophy was very simple. If someone came to him and they were sick, the term he used is he would puke them. He would make them throw up. He would give them lobelia, which is an herb that's a wonderful herb. But if you give someone a lot of it, it's an emetic. It makes them throw up. And the interesting thing about lobelia is if you give just a tiny dose to someone who's nauseous, it'll make them stop throwing up, because it's a nervine herb. But he would make them throw up all the bad stuff, and then he would warm them up with cayenne pepper. And 9 times out of 10, it would work. It would work really good, because that's usually what's going on with your body. Your body is trying to get rid of toxins, either through diarrhea or dysentery or nausea or the sweats or whatever, and this just aided the process. And then the cayenne would strengthen the person and give the person energy. The common people loved him, but the doctors fought him. And one time he made the mistake of going to New York City, and while he was practicing there, he was accused of murdering a patient. And it was false, because the patient showed up at his trial to testify on his behalf. He wasn't even dead, you know, but he still got thrown in prison. So he actually became, and it's funny to say this, he became the first multi-level marketer. He figured out that if he practiced medicine, he could get in trouble, because he wasn't a doctor. So instead, he made patent medicines and sold them to people who sold them to people who sold them to people, you know, just like Amway or Shackley or whatever. And he made a lot of money doing this, and he really started getting the doctors on the run. Now, there was also another movement. It was called the eclectic movement. And this was started by an herbalist named Worcester Beach. And this guy worked and qualified to be a real medical doctor. So he was trying to combine the best of both worlds. And he did a lot of scientific research and study in the field of herbalism. Because of the enormous success of these people, the medical doctors started to be threatened financially. Like the herbalists were so effective that by the middle of the 19th century, a typical herbalist or homeopath was making $4,000 a year, which doesn't sound like much, but back then it was a lot of money. The typical medical doctor was only making $1,000 a year. And that was because no one was going to them. You had to be desperate to want to have somebody put mercury or leeches on you. Now, it's interesting. The oldest professional medical society in America is the American Institute of Homeopathy. And not to be outdone, in retaliation, the AMA was founded in 1847. This is where the conspiracy really gets going. This is the politicization of medicine. John D. Rockefeller got involved in the struggle. See, and all of you know he's part of one of those names, you know, that you always see in conjunction with the Illuminati and the elite and what have you. And he was trying to sell crude oil in bottles as a patent medicine. And it wasn't going very well. And he got the idea, well, what if we created a whole chemical medicine industry to rival what was going on with the herbalists? And so Rockefeller and Carnegie poured millions into the AMA to bolster chemical medicine. They took out advertising. They owned their own newspapers, some of these rich guys, and so they attacked the herbalists, they attacked the eclectics and homeopaths. There were some other blows that happened about this time to U.S. health. One of the worst was the use of the steel roller mill to refine whole wheat grains and sugar cane, thus creating white flour and white sugar, two of the most toxic substances anybody ever has consumed in the history of mankind. Also in early 20th century, manufacturers learned how to hydrogenate oils. And of course, that has caused lots of problems. 1930s, they used more toxic solvents to get even more oil out of plants. Now, this is kind of strange. Because of what was being done with the steel roller mill, doctors even started noticing an extraordinary thing. The people that were eating these bread products were suffering from malnutrition. They weren't getting any vitamins because these breads were nutritionally inert. In fact, you can put some white flour on a shelf and those bugs won't eat it because they know better. So the grocers love it. It'll stay there forever. That stuff will outlast the pyramids, because nothing will eat it except us, And so they said, well, let's add vitamin B vitamins to an iron to the bread. And how many of you can remember when Wonder Bread first came out, build strong bodies 8 ways, and then it was build strong bodies 12 ways. And it's a joke, I heard a doctor say this. He said, imagine if you were walking down an alley and some guy mugged you. He took all your money, he took all your clothes, and then gave you back your socks. That's what they did to Wonder Bread. You're walking around naked, but you got your socks. That's about what it is. This stuff is totally useless as food. You could get more nutrition eating the wrapper. Okay, so they passed this Enrichment Act. And then finally, in 1950s, and this is within almost all of our lifetimes, food processing reduced the ratio between potassium and sodium in most foods. Okay, now we have the coming of the drug lords. And the use of chemical drugs got worse because Rockefeller got together with a big German chemical conglomerate called IG Farben. And IG Farben are the wonderful people that brought us mustard gas, and Zyklon B, the gas that was used in the concentration camps. They also brought us, and you see, if you take all the chemical companies today, the drug companies, Eli Lilly, Merck, and so on, and trace them back, they all go back ultimately. The head of the octopus is IG Farben. And so they came up with the idea of using the waste products from the petrochemical industry and turning them into medicine. And what's interesting is you'd be astonished at how much of the medicine today, even the over-the-counter stuff, is entirely made out of petroleum. Like, for example, if you buy Centrum vitamins and take those, the body will look at them and say, what is this? This is petroleum. I can't use this. And basically, it will go out in the draft, as it says in the King James Bible. And some of you, if you've ever heard the Dead Doctors Don't Lie tape, you know the story. But it's true that if you're in the porta potty business, like for fairs or whatever, you'll find hundreds of Centrum and one-a-day vitamin pills in the latrines, in the porta potties, because the body just poops them right out without even touching them, because they have no nutritional value. You might as well be chewing marbles. In fact, you might get more nutrition out of the marbles. And all these ideas were born out of the idea that they could create a magic bullet drug that would cure anything. And of course, out of that came antibiotics. The wonder drug, penicillin, that would cure everything. And of course, now we know what happened. We started using it. We started overusing it, and now we're in a big mess because we've started getting these superbugs that are resistant to penicillin, to oxacillin, to tetracycline, and you got flesh-eating bacteria and all kinds of ungodly stuff. You see, it's not nice to fool with Mother Nature. Okay, now these drugs are toxic. By definition, the FDA says a drug has to have side effects or it can't be a drug. So even the most benign drug you can think of, aspirin, for example. We all know aspirin can cause stomach problems. It can cause bleeding ulcers if you take too much of it. It can cause your blood to get too thin. Now, this is interesting. The definition of pharmaceutical medicine is giving patients sublethal doses of toxic medicine, of toxic chemicals. So in other words, you're giving them just under what would kill them, and that's medicine. So much for the Hippocratic Oath. If you go to the PDR, which is this huge book, the Physician's Desk Reference, it's like the Bible that doctors use. 150 pages talk about the good things drugs do. 2,850 pages talk about the bad things drugs do. So you can see it's not a real good trade-off. Now, why do we do it then? Well, because there's a huge amount of money involved. Huge amount of money. In the U.S. alone, the drug companies have revenues of over $100 billion. And internationally, it amounts to 3 times that amount. And with that kind of money, these companies can exert enormous influence. You've heard the golden rule, them that has the gold makes the rules. So the drug lobby, that's not the one Jesus had in mind, by the way. The drug lobby has incredible power in Washington, D.C., and the pharmaceutical giants additionally endow medical schools with millions, thus exerting control over what doctors learn. Well, also what doctors earn. Huge advertising budgets also. They will see, and I'm sure if any of you watch TV or read magazines, it's like every other ad is a drug ad. You know, and I just love those ads because on the first page, you see these happy people out in nature, you know, and they're all glowing with health and the colors are vibrant and wonderful and beautiful. And, you know, and then you turn the page in this little eeny-weeny, like 7-point type print, there's like column after column after column of all the bad stuff that can happen to you if you take the drug. But they know, most people, especially if you're like me and you're over 50, you can't even read that. You know, it's so tiny. So anyway, then we get into the infamous iron triangle, which I've already alluded to. The FDA allows, in fact, encourages drug companies to make enormous profits. The people who work for the FDA later go to work for the pharmaceutical companies. The FDA seems to exist. It's supposed to be here to protect us. It's supposed to protect our food. It's supposed to protect our water. It's supposed to protect, you know, us from bad drugs too, certainly. Is it doing that? No. In fact, we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But what it does do is the FDA does prevent us from accessing a lot of really important information about herb supplements and drugs. And they control what the medical students learn. Also, there's a lot of government censorship. See, drug companies have no economic interest in promoting herbs because they can't make any money off them. See, you can't you can't patent an herb. Why? God made the herb. Like you can patent Tylenol because some company made Tylenol, but you can't patent echinacea or golden seal because it's just out there in the field. Anybody can grow it. Anybody can pick it. And so there's no money in it to speak of compared to the amount of money you can make off of a prescription drug. Therefore, the FDA has rules that prohibit people from learning how vitamins and herbs can help their conditions. Additionally, all the training most MDs receive is pharmaceutical based unless they take the initiative and spend their own hard-earned cash. And I don't know if any of you get Time Magazine, but just this last week before I left on this tour, Time Magazine had a story about how finally, after years, the American Association of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers has issued a guideline to stop giving doctors all this free, like, you know, what they'll do is a new drug comes out. The doctor will get an ad saying, you can go down to Cancun free on us for a week and get some important in-service training about the new drug Ghibli bomb, or whatever they call it. And, you know, and then they get down there and they can play golf, they can surf, they can lay in the sun, they can gamble in the casinos, and a couple hours a day they have to sit through some in-service training. And then they get lots of free samples. And I know, I'm sure all of you have been to a doctor and he's given you free samples of a drug. Well, that's how they get them. Well, finally, and believe me, this was getting to be a scandal. Both the AMA was starting to disapprove of it, and even the pharmaceutical companies said, let's stop this. Because they were sending doctors off to Hawaii, doctors down to the Caribbean, and giving them all sorts of free benefits, free golf clubs, this, that, and the other thing. Also, okay, I talked about that. Now, what about the profits? These profits are huge. Now, just let's look at an example. Let's take Celebrex, which is really advertised a lot right now. A typical consumer price for 100 tabs of Celebrex, 100 milligrams, is $130. How much does it cost the drug company to make that? 60 cents. That's a 21,712% markup. I wish I could do that with my book. Man, I could sell one book and retire, amen. Here's Prozac, everybody's favorite drug, Prozac. $247 for 100 Prozac capsules. It cost them 11 cents. You see why that's such a huge cash cow? That's a 224,973% profit. And then there's the ever popular Xanax, which is a highly addictive drug, by the way. Costs $136. It actually costs the drug company a little over 2 cents. So that's a 569,958% profit. And, can you justify that? What will the drug companies say? They'll say, well, we have our research and development costs. It costs us a lot of money. It costs us millions and millions of dollars to bring one of these drugs to market. Now, there is some truth in that, yes. But there's other issues here. The FDA artificially keeps prices high. If you look at this chart, you'll see, first of all, quantity, the name of the drug, quantity and potency. Then the purple is the U.S. price. The green is the European price. The pink is the Canadian price. So, for example, Cipro, which we're hearing a lot about right now because of anthrax. Well, that costs $87 for 20 Cipro tablets. In Europe, you can get it for $40. In Canada, you can get it for $53, $55. Or Prozac. Prozac, $91 for 20 capsules. In Europe, it's only $18.50. And in Canada, it's $20.91. You could just drive, 800 miles north or whatever it is, and, but that's illegal. The FDA, if they catch you crossing the border with your Prozac, you'll get busted for illegal drugs, even though it's the same drug. And if you try and go on, there's all sorts of websites you can go to where you can buy drugs over in Europe. You have a prescription, it's a perfectly legitimate prescription, you give them the number and they'll sell you the same drug at like half the price. But if the FDA catches it going through the border, why aren't these guys watching for terrorists, Anyhow, if they catch it, they confiscate it and you're out your money. And plus, the FDA has put pressure on these other countries to shut down these operations. Just like, we put the squeeze on Colombia to shut down the cocaine thing. And they refuse to let foreign drugs in the United States. And here's the hypocrisy. The FDA has told Congress that the drugs over in Europe are inferior to the drugs we make here in America. What they don't tell you is the raw materials that the U.S. drug companies use to make the drugs here come from Europe. So it's a bunch of hypocrisy. Drug companies patent drugs and then charge very high prices. But the problem is that now they say, oh, it's research and development costs. What they don't tell you is that most of the research and development is done at our expense at the National Institute of Health. Think about that. Here's a taxpayer-funded, awesome laboratory. I mean, this is like the state-of-the-art world laboratory for doing biochemical research in medicine. And our tax dollars are paying for it. Then when they come close to discovering some wonderful drug, the drug company snaps it up and patents it. And then turns around and we pay for it twice if we buy the drug. Additionally, not many new drugs that come on the market are really new. They're just tiny variations on old drugs. Why do they do that? Well, like, for example, let's take Prozac. You saw the kind of money Prozac is making. Well, the patent on Prozac is running out. There's not much they can do about that except, try and bribe the generic companies, which they sometimes do, to not make generics. So what they do is they make Prozac Jr., or they make Son of Prozac, or they make Luvox, or they make Buspar, or whatever. And these are just drugs that are just eeny-weeny tweaks in the original formula, so it doesn't take that much R&D to bring those things to market. Now, the Bible tells us we should count the cost and things. Many drugs are quite effective, and like I've said, like when I had kidney stones and they were kicking up and I had kidney pain in my back, I went to the hospital. I says, hey, give me drugs, man. That was okay. But they do carry a price beyond the dollars. Because they are toxic, many drugs attack the very body systems they're supposed to help. And I'm going to give you an example. I wish I had time for more than one. Cardiac disease is the #1 killer in America. These are the common drugs that are given to people for cardiac disease. ACE inhibitors are prescribed. They cause zinc deficiency. Zinc is absolutely essential for muscle function and also for what are called sphincters or valves to work properly. Gee, does your heart have some valves in it? Yeah, it does. Beta blockers deplete coenzyme Q10 and melatonin. Now, some of you might not know what CoQ10 is, but it's a coenzyme, which actually means it's a vitamin, but not really. And it's very helpful to the heart because what it does is it energizes the mitochondria of your cell, which is the energy factory within each and every cell of your body, to give the muscles energy to work. Now, of course, the heart is the one muscle that, beats all the time. It never rests. You could be fast asleep and your heart's still lub-dubbing away, lub-dub, lub-dub. So it needs CoQ10 desperately. In fact, if any of you in here don't know this, if you have heart problems, you should be taking CoQ10, at least 100 milligrams a day. It's a little expensive, but believe me, it's worth its weight in gold. Calcium channel blockers deplete potassium. And remember what I said before about the fact that since the changes in diet in the turn of the century, Americans are getting far too much sodium and their potassium-sodium balance is out of whack? Well, if you deplete potassium, it makes the energy pump that's in every cell of your body work that much less efficiently. And that means your heart is going to work less efficiency. Digoxin, which is a major heart stimulant, depletes calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and vitamin B1. Hydralazine, another key drug, depletes CoQ10 and vitamin B6. You absolutely have to have vitamin B6 for your heart to work. So the very drugs that are supposed to be helping you are actually, and it's like basically what happens is once you get on these things, unless you take these supplements to help your body out, and then take more than normal, in fact, you're going to be on those things the rest of your life, and probably in ever-increasing doses. And of course, that's what the medical, or at least the pharmaceutical companies want. They want you hooked on these things. Now, we talk about the drug war and everything. Believe it or not, far more people die every year from prescription drugs than die from illegal drugs. You can take all the people that die of heroin overdose or meth or ecstasy. We're hearing a lot about kids dying. And I'm not diminishing the tragedy of kids or adults that die from illegal drugs. What I'm saying is it's nothing compared to the people that die from killer drugs. And see, here's the difference, okay? If you are an adult or a young person and you're dumb enough to get into heroin or meth or ecstasy, you know it's dangerous. You've been told by your parents and your teachers in the DARE program or whatever the heck, that it's dangerous. You figure, well, I'm a kid, I'm going to live forever, so I'm going to take this anyway. Ha, ha, ha. What do you know? Well, on the other hand, these prescription drugs, we're told they're safe. We aren't told that they have these, well, we're told they have side effects, but they're kind of minimized. Now, Lancet magazine is like the official journal of the British Medical Society. It indicated the number of deaths from prescription drugs tripled between 83 and 93. Now, JAMA, that's the Journal of the American Medical Association, showed that 106,000 hospitalized patients, that's not the people that are dying at home in their bed. These are hospitalized patients, die annually from drugs. 2.2 million suffer serious complications. And again, these are from prescription drugs. Drug reactions are the fourth leading cause of death in America. Think of that. They're right behind, heart disease, cancer, and AIDS. This is a statement by a guy from Harvard Medical School. Medicine is now a high-risk industry like aviation, but the chance of dying in an airplane accident is 1 in 2 million, while the chance of dying from a medical accident is 1 in 200. Think of that. You look at a big hospital, probably like one you might have in Kansas City, 200 people probably go in and out of that place every day. One of them probably will die, and not just from old age. I already said this, but pharmaceutical drugs kill far more people than illegal street drugs. Now think of this. Drug deaths are the daily equivalent of a jumbo jet crashing and killing every single one of its passengers every day of the year. 290.4 people. Now imagine this. Let's say you're Boeing and you're making jets. And every day, a Boeing jet crashes. Just... You think there'd be an outcry? You think the press and the government would be all over Boeing like a cheap suit? Of course they would. But where's the outcry? Why isn't 2020 and 60 Minutes and all the rest doing big exposés on this horrible thing? We're all stunned because 3,000 people were killed in the World Trade Center incident. But heck, that's just 10 days of what goes on in taking drugs in America. I'll tell you where the outcry is. These news agencies, ABC, CBS, NBC, and so on, are getting millions and millions of dollars from the drug industry, and they aren't going to say much. There's a problem of bias as well. The FDA is very, very slow to react to drug problems. And we're going to talk about that more in a couple of minutes. But it's really kind of a scandal. They won't do anything. I mean, it's like, half the country has to be dead before they'll take a drug off the market. Also, there's evidence of FDA preference for drug treatments over other methods that work better. And the other thing that really irritates me, and I kind of alluded to this, is media like television. Almost every night on the news in our area, at least, in eastern Iowa, we get these puff pieces about the wonderful hospitals and the wonderful drugs and this new drug came out and how it's going to help so many women with this or so many men with that or children or whatever, and how great this is. And then they downplay the drug deaths. You never hear about them. But man, oh man, if somebody gets sick from a vitamin or if somebody gets sick from an herb, it's probably, front page, 25-point headlines. So, that isn't balanced. That isn't balanced at all. Think of it this way. In the past decade, over 1 million people have died from taking properly prescribed pharmaceutical drugs, and very little is done about it. In the same time, less than 5 people have died from herbs, and yet comfrey is now a controlled substance. It's a very wonderful herb, but you can no longer buy it for internal consumption in any health food store legally. You can buy it if you buy it like in bulk, and it's only going to be used as a poultice or something, but you can no longer get it in a capsule. And that's, I think, a real serious crime against humanity. Forget the human tragedy for a moment. Look at the money. James Duke, who's an awesome herbalist, and he's also a USDA licensed medical botanist, points out that drug reactions cost the citizens of this country $136 billion a year, and the drug companies only make $100 billion. So we're actually losing money, aside from losing lives. But like a preacher friend of mine said, if it don't make sense, there's a buck in it. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has taken away 2 of our precious rights, our right to know and our right to choose. What do I mean by that? Well, it takes away our right to choose for example, there's a drug, a prescription drug called Hydergine. Some of you may have heard of it. It's perfectly safe. It's excellent for the brain. especially when you start getting to be my age, but even younger. It has been shown over and over again to really help cognitive ability. And yet, doctors are forbidden to prescribe it for anybody except someone with Parkinson's disease. They can't do it. And this has been around for decades. It's one of the safest drugs around. That's just one sample of that. And of course, our right to know. Well, we're going to talk about that in a moment. For example, the FDA frequently approves dangerous drugs. One good example, it's not a drug exactly, is aspartame or NutraSweet, which the FDA rushed through, and that stuff's a nerve toxin, for heaven's sake. I wouldn't feed that to my worst enemy. And yet it's in all these diet drinks, Additionally, the FDA approves chemotherapy drugs that routinely kill. Also, there's a class of drugs that are called NSAIDs. That stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Acetaminophen or Tylenol would be the best known example. People have died from that drug, even over the counter. People who drink moderate amounts of alcohol and take Tylenol can die from moderate doses of it. It causes serious liver damage. 7,000 people a year die from NSAIDs, and yet it's still on the market. There's 161 cases, according to one study, documented of death from people who took 8 to 10 extra-strength Tylenol daily. Think of that. And yet they don't do anything about it. Xanax. FDA failed to order adequate testing. It never went beyond 8 weeks of clinical trials. It takes longer than that for someone to get addicted to it. Now they found out that Xanax is even more addictive than Valium. If you get off the drug, there's depression, there's seizures and suicide. The drug is harder to kick than heroin. 8,000 ER visits a year are attributed to Xanax due to interaction between Xanax and other drugs. In 1976 through 1985, the GAO did a study and found that 61% of the drugs approved by the FDA had serious adverse reactions that caused the drugs to either be recalled or seriously relabeled. 102 of these drugs were found to have serious enough side effects to warrant withdrawal. Adverse drug reactions put 243,000 older Americans in the hospital and caused dizziness or fainting spells among thousands of others. Approximately 163,000 older adults suffered drug-induced memory loss or impaired thinking, and another 61,000 suffer Parkinson-like symptoms, where you get the tremors and everything. Another 32,000 older Americans suffer hip fractures based on drug-induced falls. And of course, if you're elderly and you fall and break your hip, it's like, a lot of times that's kind of like the beginning of the end, because it just seems to be hard to come back from something like that. Secondly, the FDA suppresses important information about life-saving substances and herbs. For example, vitamin E. Now, we have known that vitamin E will help prevent heart disease since the 1940s. Since before I was even born, we've known this. And yet a doctor is forbidden from telling a patient that if they have cardiomyopathy or some kind of heart disease, that they should take vitamin E. They're forbidden from doing it. If they get caught doing that, they can be fined or imprisoned. Even though there's a stack this high of studies, of peer-reviewed journals that show demonstrable improvements just from taking 400 IUs of vitamin E a day. Think of that. One doctor said, off the record, that if you got every person in America to take 400 IUs of vitamin E a day, you could cut the medical bills of this country in half. Just like that. Because cardiac disease is such a killer in this country, and it would be so helpful. Additionally, folic acid. Now, this is a biggie. For years, the FDA forbade vitamin companies from telling pregnant women and women of childbearing age they needed folic acid in their diet. And as a result, 13,000 children were born crippled with horrible diseases like spina bifida and other diseases that are really, really very, very, you wouldn't want to wish that on an innocent child. And they wouldn't do it. They would not allow it. It's only been really in the last, and I remember walking through an airport a couple of years ago, speaking somewhere, and seeing some ad about some model or someone who's, standing there looking all cute and sexy, and she says, even though so-and-so isn't pregnant, she's still taking her folic acid. And I thought, well, gee, finally. I knew about this stuff 30 years ago. But you see, most women, and most men for that matter in America, don't have time to read these journals. They don't have time to do all that. They're lucky if they can read a multivitamin bottle. We're too busy. The doctors should be telling us this stuff, and they don't. And it's not their fault. They're not allowed to. It's interesting. In a Dietary Supplements Task Force report in 1992, the FDA stated that part of its job, and this is a direct quote, was to ensure that the existence of dietary supplements on the market does not act as a disincentive for drug development. Now that's kind of big bureaucratese. What does that mean? It means that the FDA is supposed to ensure that the existence of herbs and vitamins doesn't cost the drug company any business. That's what they're doing, and they're doing a pretty darn good job of it. Okay, the other thing is it unnecessarily delays the approval of life-saving drugs. It takes 8.5 years longer to get a drug approved here in America than it does in Europe. 2.7 million Americans died due to the delay in approval of just one drug, Enderol, that was approved for use in Europe for many years. And of course, we've already seen how much more all this protection costs us, how much more we pay for drugs than our European counterparts. Now, the other thing is, what does the FDA do about protecting us from contaminants? The official position, you'll be thrilled to know this, the official position of the FDA is that our drinking water out of the tap is perfectly safe. Absolutely safe. This in spite of the fact that there's been a 50% increase in bladder and rectal cancer among those who drink tap water. In the 1930s, the FDA said it was fraudulent to claim that purified bottled water was more healthy than tap water. It spent 22 years litigating against a company that made that claim and ultimately beat them off the market. Is the FDA protecting us to death? For example, the FDA routinely blocks life-saving devices. And I don't have time to go into all of them, but there's many of them that are kept off the market, like defibrillators, like things women can use at home to more readily detect breast cancer and stuff like that, and they keep them off the market for whatever dumb reason. And, also the FDA kills more people than it saves if you look at the numbers. Pesticides and herbicides in modern food production and agriculture are causing much higher rates in cancer. Realize that 60 to 65% of all produce has pesticides in it. Many foods have unsafe levels, especially if you're feeding them to a child. Private labs have tested the same produce the FDA tests, and they find 6 times more pesticides than the FDA does. The FDA isn't doing its job. Meat packing plants. Once every 10 years, an FDA inspector visits a meatpacking plant. You think that does any good? Heck no. I mean, that's why we're getting E. coli in our hamburger. The FDA checks only 1% of imported produce. For 12 years, the FDA failed to protect us against contaminated orange juice. So not only is it doing stuff it's not supposed to do, it's not doing the stuff it's supposed to do. And yet you'd think, what's going on here? Is there a conspiracy? Well, here's the interesting thing. Is there a revolving door between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry? How many FDA bureaucrats used to work for drug companies or vice versa? In addition to the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us of, is there a medical-industrial complex? Is this why the U.S. is among the sickest nations on earth? Listen to this. A recent USA Today article, this is from 9/25/2000, reported that more than half the experts hired by the government to determine the safety and effectiveness of medicine have financial relationships with drug companies. The USA Today found that 54% of the time they have a direct financial interest in the drug or topic they're supposed to evaluate. the federal law prohibits this. It's not supposed to be happening, but just since 1998 through 2000, the FDA has waived the restriction 800 times. 800 times in 2 years. For example, 8 out of 10 of the members who evaluate the drug Aggrastat, made by Merck, had conflicts of interest. 80%. These figures underestimate the problem because only 52% of those contacted for the survey responded. Finally, according to JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association 26/2002, 87% of experts on the committees have ties to the drug industry. Think of that. So, we've presented the problem, now we need to talk about what the solution is. What does the Bible say about this vital issue? Because God is concerned about our health. And I'm sure many of you know this passage, but if you go to the 3rd epistle of John, 2nd verse, he says, "Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth." So God wants us spiritually healthy, certainly, but he also wants us physically healthy. Remember, this body is his temple. He doesn't want it full of toxic junk. He doesn't want it all run down. And, you look at the great men of God in the Bible. It says Moses got up to, I think, 125 years old, and it said his strength didn't fail, and his vital force was still with him. That's because he was a vitalist. Not only that, we know people in the old days lived to be 800 or 900 years before the flood. There's a reason for that, and we're going to look at that. First of all, we need to explain the principle of Bible hermeneutics. That's just a big word. It means how do we interpret the Bible correctly. There's an important Bible tool called the law of first mention. And let's look at healing. The first mention of healing indicates that it comes from God. Genesis 20:17 says, "Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bear children." Now, most people would agree, most Christians of whatever denomination would agree that yes, healing comes from God. And we believe that the Bible teaches God heals miraculously in response to the faithful prayers of his people. We also want to make clear that even though we believe God heals, we also believe there's nothing wrong with going to doctors if you're sick. And please, again, don't misunderstand that I'm not saying that it's bad to go to doctors or it's evil or doctors are evil. Most doctors are fine men and women. We don't believe God forbids the use of doctors. We just think that there are other ways you can go first, and if those don't happen to work, then go to a doctor. And the first thing I would always say is pray. If you have a headache, if you have a toothache, if you have a backache, ask the Lord to heal it, and he might even heal it. Hallelujah. Now, in the light of the above statement about, God healing, it's evident, I believe, that the vitalist approach is much closer to the Bible, both philosophically and historically. By definition, vitalists believe that God, however they might conceive him, is foremost in healing. Because, again, obviously Hippocrates was not a Christian, he was a pagan. But he still gave God the credit for healing. However, here's the problem. God is not typically discussed in most AMA-endorsed medical schools or programs as a source of healing. Although the funny thing is there are some doctors, like Dr. Larry Dawsey, who are now talking about prayer as an adjunct to healing. But unfortunately, most of the people, and there's nurses that do this, there's a whole movement called therapeutic touch and stuff like that, but it's all kind of new agey foo-foo stuff, and you need to be careful with it. But at least they're starting to talk about this stuff, at least. Now, again, this is not to say that individual MDs might not have great faith in the Lord. I know many fine Christian doctors and many fine Christian nurses and, other health practitioners. So, nothing against any of that. It's just that what I'm saying is there's a general bias in both medicine and psychiatry against spirituality and especially against Christian spirituality. Now, what about physicians? When we're looking at what the Bible says, we've already noted how this word got started. It was, you recall, the doctor of physic. and it came up during the early Middle Ages. The first mention of physicians in the Bible bears out medical history, which is no surprise. The Bible is always right, that they are Egyptian. In Genesis 50, verse 2, this is the first time the word is used. It says, "And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel." Now, isn't that interesting? The first time the word physicians are used, it is in regards to death and the use of toxic embalming chemicals, because most of us know that, the kind of stuff they embalm people with, you wouldn't want to drink it. Okay. Almost all references to physicians in the Bible are negative, and there you see some of them listed. Interestingly, in Luke 5:31, Jesus underscored the symptom-oriented approach of physicians. He said, "They that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick." Now, a vitalist would teach that those who are whole need a good herbalist to help them stay whole. Okay. Another interesting thing just to mention briefly, have any of you heard of the Barefoot Doctor's Manual? I'd be surprised if you had. It's a fascinating book. It's about this thick, and it is the official manual of Chinese medical doctors. And they have an interesting approach over there, which I think we need to copy over here. First of all, they still do house calls. Second of all, they have a policy over there. The way it works is you pay the doctor a small fee every week until you get sick, because it's his job to keep you healthy. And then when you get sick, you stop paying him until you get well. Now, can you imagine what that would do to our medical system over here? Say if you paid think of what we pay for health insurance. The costs are outlandish. If we were to pay our doctors, say, $5 a week just to keep us healthy. And then when you got sick, they'd have to really sweat, to get us going again, But now it's almost, I hate to say it, but it's almost their financial incentive to get us sick and then keep us sick. Not that they would do that deliberately, I would hope. But anyway, the only positive reference to physician would be Jeremiah 8:22, which also contains a reference to the balm of Gilead, which is a healing oil, Matthew 9:12, and Mark 2:17. Of course, there's also Luke, the beloved physician, who's mentioned in Colossians 4:14. Paul talks about him as being with him. And you got to realize, though, Luke would have been trained in the Hippocratic form of vitalistic medicine. He would not have been giving Paul shots and chemotherapy and stuff like that. Okay, now, we need to understand where all this comes in terms of what the devil's trying to do. Because, as Stan said at the beginning, the devil is here to steal, kill, and destroy. And part of the way the Illuminati does things is they set up what they call